The signal came from the deepest parts of space on a Tuesday morning when Dr. Lisa Martinez was drinking her third cup of coffee. She worked at the Cheyenne Mountain Deep Space Monitoring Station in Colorado, a place where most days passed without anything exciting happening. The big radio dishes pointed at the stars caught all kinds of signals, but 99% of them were just natural space noise or signals from Earth satellites bouncing around. Lisa had been working there for 8 years and had never seen anything like what appeared on her screen that morning. The signal was clearly artificial, structured in mathematical patterns that no natural phenomenon could create. But more than that, it was repeating the same message over and over again, broadcasting in multiple directions across the galaxy. She called her supervisor immediately. Dr. Frank Williams came running down the hall so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. Frank had worked in space communications for 25 years and had always hoped to be the first person to detect alien intelligence. When he saw Lisa's screen, his hand started shaking. The signal was complex but followed mathematical principles that any intelligent species would understand. It contained prime numbers, basic geometric shapes, and what looked like star charts. But buried in all that data was something that made both scientists' hearts race. It was clearly a distress call. Within 2 hours, the Colorado facility had contacted Earth Defense Command headquarters in Washington. Admiral Jack Porter was in a meeting about military budgets when his aide burst through the door with news that would change everything. The aide, a young lieutenant named Bobby Chen, had run all the way from the communications center. Admiral Porter was a career military man who had seen action in 3 different conflicts on Earth. He was not easily surprised or excited, but when Bobby explained what the scientists in Colorado had found, Porter felt something he had not experienced since his first combat mission. His mouth went dry and his pulse quickened. The Admiral immediately contacted President Amy Johnson, who was at Camp David for the weekend with her family. The president had been in office for 2 years and had dealt with economic crises, natural disasters, and international tensions. But nothing had prepared her for the call she received that Saturday afternoon. President Johnson flew back to Washington within hours. She called an emergency meeting of her top advisors, including the Secretary of Defense, the head of NASA, and the director of the CIA. They gathered in the White House Situation Room, a place usually reserved for discussions of war and national security. Today, they were talking about something that had never happened before in human history. Dr. Lisa Martinez was flown to Washington to explain her findings. She stood in front of the most powerful people on Earth and tried to keep her voice steady as she described the signal. The message was coming from a star system 43 light-years away. The aliens were clearly desperate, broadcasting their plea for help in every direction they could. The translation team worked around the clock. Dr. Martinez led a group of linguists, mathematicians, and computer scientists in the most important decoding project ever attempted. They had help from universities around the world, as governments quietly shared the discovery with their best researchers. After 5 days of constant work, they had decoded enough of the message to understand the basic situation. The aliens called, themselves the Zephyrians, and their homeworld was dying. Their planet's core was becoming unstable, causing their entire ecosystem to collapse. They were offering to share their advanced technology with anyone who could help them. President Johnson faced the biggest decision any human leader had ever confronted. First contact with alien intelligence was happening not through peaceful exploration, but through a desperate cry for help. The president knew that how humanity responded would define their species' future relationship with the galaxy. She authorized the formation of Earth's first interstellar diplomatic mission. The team would travel to the Zephyrian homeworld and attempt to provide assistance. It was a mission that would require humanity's best scientists, engineers, and diplomats. Captain Ryan Blake was chosen to lead the expedition. He commanded the bomb exploration vessel UES Horizon, Earth's most advanced starship. Blake was 42 years old and had spent his entire career preparing for deep space missions. He had served on 3 previous expeditions to nearby star systems, though none had found signs of intelligent life. Blake's crew was carefully selected for the mission. Tony Rodriguez was the ship's chief engineer, a brilliant man who could fix anything mechanical and had designed several of the Horizon's most important systems. Dr. Kate Sullivan was a biologist who specialized in extreme environments and had studied life forms in the most hostile places on Earth. Colonel Steve Harris served as the military advisor for the mission. He was an experienced soldier who had commanded peacekeeping forces in several international conflicts. His job was to protect the crew and handle any security situations that might arise during first contact. The team spent 3 weeks preparing for the journey. They studied everything known about the Zephyrian star system and practiced scenarios for meeting alien intelligence. They loaded the ship with supplies, scientific equipment, and various technologies that might be useful for helping a dying planet. Dr. Martinez joined the crew as the lead linguist and communications specialist. She would be responsible for talking with the aliens and making sure both species understood each other. The weight of this responsibility kept her awake most nights during the preparation period. The launch took place on a clear morning in October. Thousands of people gathered at the spaceport to watch humanity's first diplomatic mission to another world. President Johnson gave a speech about hope, courage, and the importance of helping others in need. She spoke about how this moment would be remembered as the day humanity joined the galactic community. Captain Blake felt the weight of history as the Horizon's engines fired and lifted the ship away from Earth. Through the viewports, he could see his homeworld growing smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among the stars. He was leading his species into the unknown, carrying the hopes and dreams of 8 billion people. The journey to the Zephyrian system would take 3 months using humanity's fastest hyperspace drive. During the long trip, the crew continued, studying the alien messages and preparing for what they would find when they arrived. They ran simulations and practiced first contact protocols until everyone knew their roles perfectly. Dr. Sullivan spent her time analyzing what little information they had about Zephyrian biology and their planet's ecosystem. The dying world seemed to depend on some kind of crystalline formations that were failing. She tried to imagine what kind of life forms could evolve in such an environment. Tony Rodriguez worked on adapting human technology to potentially interface with alien systems. He had no idea what kind of equipment the Zephyrians used, but he prepared a variety of tools and devices that might be helpful. His workshop became filled with experimental gadgets and modified instruments. Colonel Harris trained the security team and studied military protocols for contact with unknown civilizations. He hoped his services would not be needed, but he prepared for every possible scenario. His greatest fear was that human misunderstanding or alien hostility could turn the rescue mission into a disaster. As the Horizon traveled through hyperspace toward the dying alien world, none of the crew could imagine the catastrophe they were about to unleash. They were going to save a civilization, to prove that humanity deserved a place among the stars. Instead, they would become the architects of the greatest tragedy in galactic history. The UES Horizon dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zephyrian system 3 months after leaving Earth. Captain Blake stood on the bridge watching the main screen as their destination came into view. The alien star was smaller and redder than Earth's sun, casting a dim orange light across 4 planets that orbited in perfect circles. The third planet from the star was their target. Even from millions of miles away, they could see that something was wrong with the world. Instead of the blue and green colors of a healthy planet, this world showed patches of sickly yellow and brown. Huge dark spots covered entire continents, like wounds on the planet's surface. Dr. Martinez immediately began broadcasting greeting messages using the mathematical language they had developed during the journey. Within hours, they received a response. The alien voice that came through their speakers was unlike anything humans had ever heard. It sounded like music mixed with wind chimes. Beautiful, but sad. The Zephyrian who spoke to them introduced himself as Commander Veltar of the High Council. His voice carried a dignity that impressed Captain Blake, but underneath the formal words was desperate hope. Veltar had been broadcasting the distress signal for 2 years, never knowing if anyone would hear it or care enough to respond. Veltar guided the Horizon to a landing site near the Zephyrian capital city. As they descended through the planet's atmosphere, the crew got their first close look at the dying world. What should have been forests were instead vast graveyards of dead crystal formations. These crystals had once stood hundreds of feet tall, their faceted surfaces catching and focusing the star's light to power the entire planet. Now the crystals were dark and cracked. Many had fallen over, creating fields of broken glass that stretched to the horizon. The few crystals that still stood flickered weakly, their light fading like dying candles. Between the crystal formations, the crew could see cities built from the same crystalline materials, their buildings becoming dim as their power sources failed. The landing site was a flat area of fused crystal that served as the planet's main spaceport. As the horizon settled onto the surface, hundreds of Zephyrians gathered to watch the arrival of their potential saviors. Through the viewports, the human crew got their first look at alien intelligence. The Zephyrians were tall and graceful, standing nearly 8 feet in height. Their skin was translucent, showing the flow of luminous fluids beneath the surface. Most remarkable of all, their skin changed colors with their emotions. As they watched the human ship land, waves of blue and purple rippled across their bodies, indicating hope mixed with uncertainty. Captain Blake led the first contact team out of the ship. The planet's atmosphere was breathable for humans, though it felt thin and carried a strange metallic taste. Veltar approached them slowly, his movements flowing like water. When he spoke, his skin glowed with warm golden colors. The translation device worked perfectly. Veltar welcomed the humans with formal ceremony, but his words were heavy with the weight of his dying world. He explained that his people had lived in harmony with their crystalline environment for thousands of years. The crystals were not just technology, but living organisms that formed a symbiotic relationship with all life on the planet. Dr. Sullivan was fascinated by what she learned about the crystal forests. Each formation was actually a colony of billions of tiny organisms that worked together to create the larger structures. They fed on minerals from deep underground and converted the planet's magnetic field into usable energy. The crystals provided power, purified the air, and regulated the climate. But something had gone wrong in the planet's core. The magnetic field that fed the crystals was becoming unstable, causing the organisms to sicken and die. As more crystals failed, the planet's ecosystem began to collapse. The air was becoming toxic, the weather patterns were changing, and food sources were disappearing. Veltar took the human team on a tour of the capital city. The buildings rose like frozen music, their crystalline walls designed to channel and amplify light. But now many structures stood dark and empty as their crystal foundations died. The Zephyrians moved through their failing city like ghosts, their skin colors muted with grief. Tony Rodriguez studied the alien technology with growing excitement. The Zephyrians had achieved things that human science considered impossible. They could manipulate energy fields, grow structures from living crystal, and create materials that were stronger than anything Earth had developed. Their entire civilization was built on a foundation of bioengineering that surpassed human understanding. The crisis became clear as the team gathered more information. The planet's core was cooling, and its magnetic field was weakening. Without that magnetic energy, the crystal organisms could not survive. The Zephyrians had tried everything their science could devise, but they were a cautious people who took centuries to make major decisions. Time had run out before they could find a solution. Dr. Sullivan examined dying crystal samples in her portable laboratory. Under the microscope, she could see the tiny organisms that made up each formation. They were beautiful and complex, with internal structures that defied easy classification. They were neither plant nor animal, but something entirely new, a form of life that bridged the gap between living tissue and mineral crystal. Captain Blake called his team together for a strategy meeting in the Horizons briefing room. They had been on the alien world for only 3 days, but the situation was clearly desperate. According to Veltar's estimates, the planet had less than a year before the ecosystem collapsed completely. The human team brainstormed solutions with the desperate creativity that their species was known for. While the Zephyrians spent months considering every possible consequence of an action, humans were willing to try bold experiments and accept calculated risks. This difference in approach would prove to be both humanity's greatest strength and most terrible weakness. Tony Rodriguez proposed the most promising solution. Earth's fusion technology could potentially provide the energy needed to restart the planet's core stabilization process. By placing fusion reactors at key points around the planet and linking them to the crystal network, they might be able to replace the failing magnetic field with artificially generated power. Dr. Sullivan worried about the biological implications of the plan. The crystal organisms had evolved over millions of years to feed on natural magnetic energy. Introducing artificial fusion energy might disrupt their biology in unpredictable ways. But with the planet dying, any risk seemed worth taking. Colonel Harris supported the fusion plan, but insisted on starting with small-scale tests. He had seen too many military operations fail because of poor planning and insufficient preparation. He wanted to test the human technology on a single crystal formation before attempting anything on a planetary scale. Veltar presented the human plan to the Zephyrian High Council. The ancient leaders were horrified by the concept of nuclear fusion, which they considered a primitive and destructive force. Their entire philosophy was based on working in harmony with natural energies, not forcing artificial power into their environment. But desperation overcame their philosophical objections. After days of debate, the High Council gave permission for the humans to attempt their fusion experiment. Veltar would work directly with Tony Rodriguez to modify the human technology for compatibility with Zephyrian crystal systems. The first test site was a small crystal grove about 50 miles from the capital city. The formations there were among the most damaged, their light barely visible even in the planet's dim daylight. If the experiment failed, nothing of value would be lost. If it succeeded, it might provide the template for saving the entire world. Tony. Rodriguez and his engineering team worked around the clock to modify a portable fusion reactor for the test. They had to solve dozens of technical problems, from power conversion to safety protocols. The reactor had to produce energy in a form that the crystal organisms could absorb without being damaged by the process. Veltar worked alongside the human. Engineers, his skin cycling through colors that indicated intense concentration mixed with hope. He provided detailed information about crystal biology and energy absorption patterns. The cooperation between human and alien minds produced insights that neither species could have achieved alone. Dr. Sullivan monitored the health of the test crystals as the fusion reactor came online. The first surge of energy caused the formations to flicker and brighten. For a moment, it seemed like the experiment might fail as the crystals struggled to process the unfamiliar energy source. Then something wonderful happened. The crystal organisms adapted to the fusion energy and began to glow brighter than they had in years. The formations straightened and grew, their surfaces becoming clear and brilliant. The test site transformed from a dying crystal graveyard into a garden of living light. Veltar's skin blazed with golden joy as he watched his people's technology respond to human ingenuity. The other Zephyrians who had gathered to watch the test began to sing, their voices creating harmonies that made the crystals resonate with musical tones. For the first time in years, there was hope on the dying world. Captain Blake sent a message to Earth reporting the success of the first test. 3 weeks after the first successful test, Dr. Kate Sullivan noticed something that made her stomach turn cold with fear. She was reviewing the daily readings from the crystal formations when she saw patterns that should not have existed. The crystals were not just healing and growing normally, they were expanding at a rate that defied everything she understood about biological systems. The test site that had been 50 acres of dying crystal was now over 200 acres of thriving formations. New crystals were sprouting from the ground every day, growing faster than any living thing should be able to grow. The formations were becoming taller and more complex, developing structures that had never been seen before in Zephyrian history. Sullivan ran to find Tony Rodriguez, who was working with Veltar to plan the next phase of fusion reactor installation. She burst into their meeting room carrying her tablet full of data readings that painted a terrifying picture. The fusion energy was not just healing the crystals, it was causing them to reproduce and expand beyond all natural limits. Rodriguez looked at the data and felt his confidence crumble. The readings showed energy consumption levels that were impossible. The crystals were somehow drawing more power from the fusion reactor than the reactor was actually producing. They were amplifying the energy input through some process that human science could not explain. Veltar studied the data with growing alarm. His skin shifted through dark purple and red colors that indicated fear and confusion. The crystal formations were behaving in ways that violated everything his people knew about their symbiotic partners. No Zephyrian had ever seen crystals grow so quickly or consume so much energy. Colonel Harris immediately suggested shutting down the fusion reactor to stop the runaway growth. But Rodriguez explained that cutting power suddenly might cause the supercharged crystals to collapse, releasing all their stored energy at once. The explosion could destroy everything within hundreds of miles, including the Zephyrian capital city. Dr. Sullivan made a discovery that turned their concern into horror. The crystal growth was not limited to the test site. Her instruments detected similar energy signatures appearing at locations across the planet. Somehow, the fusion-powered crystals were communicating with other crystal formations and triggering growth at remote locations. The crystal network that had once been the foundation of Zephyrian civilization was becoming something new and dangerous. The formations were growing beyond their natural boundaries, breaking through the ground in areas where crystals had never existed before. They were consuming minerals from deep underground and converting everything they touched into more crystal structure. Veltar contacted the High Council to report the crisis. The ancient leaders responded with panic and confusion. Some demanded that the humans shut down their dangerous technology immediately. Others argued that stopping the process might make the situation worse. The council fell into chaos as different. Factions blamed each other for allowing the experiment to proceed. Captain Blake called an emergency meeting of his senior staff. The situation was spiraling beyond their control, and they needed to make critical decisions without guidance from Earth. The communication delay meant that any message sent to Earth would take months to reach home, and the response would take months to return. They were on their own. The crisis accelerated with each passing day. New crystal formations appeared in the Zephyrian cities, growing through buildings and infrastructure. The crystals were beautiful but destructive, their expansion cracking foundations and toppling structures that had stood for centuries. Millions of Zephyrians were forced to evacuate their homes as crystal growth made entire districts uninhabitable. Dr. Sullivan worked desperately to understand what was happening to the crystal organisms. She discovered that the fusion energy had activated dormant genetic sequences that had been hidden in the crystal biology for millions of years. The organisms were reverting to an ancient form that was designed to spread rapidly and consume entire planets. The truth was more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The crystal organisms were not just symbiotic partners with the Zephyrians. They were ancient terraforming tools left behind by a long-dead civilization. The original creators had designed them to convert worlds into crystal matrices that could support their form of life. The Zephyrians had been living with weapons of planetary destruction without knowing it. Tony Rodriguez discovered that the fusion energy was somehow creating a quantum entanglement between crystal formations across vast distances. When one formation absorbed energy and began to grow, it transmitted that growth pattern to every other crystal on the planet through subspace communication. The entire crystal network was becoming a single massive organism with a collective consciousness. The situation became even worse when Veltar reported that 2 of the Zephyrian colony worlds were experiencing similar crystal growth. The quantum entanglement was not limited to a single planet. It was spreading across star systems, threatening every world where Zephyrian crystals existed. What had started as a rescue mission was becoming a galactic catastrophe. Colonel Harris took charge of evacuation planning as the crystal growth accelerated. Entire continents were becoming uninhabitable as massive crystal spires burst through the ground. The formations were growing so fast that they generated their own weather patterns, creating storms and earthquakes that added to the destruction. The Zephyrian population was in panic. Refugees streamed away from the expanding crystal zones, but there were few safe places left on the planet. The crystals were appearing everywhere, following underground mineral deposits and energy sources. Some Zephyrians began to blame the humans for bringing this catastrophe to their world. Dr. Sullivan made another horrifying discovery while studying the spreading crystal growth. The formations were not just consuming minerals and energy. They were also absorbing organic matter, breaking down plant and animal life and incorporating the material into their crystal structure. The crystals were converting the entire biosphere of the planet into extensions of themselves. Veltar's government began to collapse as different regions of the planet lost contact with each other. The crystal growth was disrupting communication, networks, and transportation systems. The unified Zephyrian civilization that had existed for thousands of years was fragmenting as communities became isolated by expanding crystal barriers. The human team realized they were witnessing the death of an entire species. The Zephyrians had survived for millennia by living in careful balance with their crystal environment. Now that balance was broken beyond repair, and their world was being consumed by the very organisms they had considered partners and friends. Captain Blake sent desperate messages to Earth describing the catastrophe they had accidentally caused. He knew that the communications would not reach home for months, but he needed to warn humanity about the dangers of the crystal technology. If the growth pattern ever reached Earth, human civilization could face the same destruction. Tony Rodriguez worked around the clock trying to find a way to stop or reverse the crystal growth. He experimented with different energy frequencies and electromagnetic pulses, but nothing seemed to slow the expansion. The crystals had become self-sustaining and were drawing energy from sources that human technology could not affect. The crystal formations continued to grow larger and more complex. Some reached heights of over 1,000 feet, towering over the landscape like alien monuments. They pulsed with internal light that could be seen from space, creating a network of glowing nodes across the planet's surface. The world was transforming into something that was no longer suitable for any form of natural life. Dr. Sullivan calculated that at the current rate of growth, the planet would be completely converted to crystal within 6 months. Every trace of the original Zephyrian biosphere would be erased, replaced by an artificial environment that served the needs of the crystal organisms. It would be the end of everything the Zephyrians had built and everything they were. Veltar approached Captain Blake with a request that broke the human leader's heart. The Zephyrian commander asked if humanity could help evacuate the survivors to other worlds. Their home was lost, but perhaps some of their people could escape to build new lives elsewhere. It was an admission of total defeat, the end of a civilization that had lasted longer than human history. Colonel Harris began planning the largest evacuation in galactic history. The UES Horizon could carry only a few thousand passengers, but Earth had other ships that could potentially help. The problem was time. It would take months for rescue ships to arrive, and the crystal growth was accelerating every day. The team realized they were facing an impossible choice. They could focus on evacuation and save some Zephyrians while accepting the loss of their world. Or they could continue trying to find a scientific solution that might save the planet but could cost precious time that would result in more deaths. As massive crystal spires continued to erupt from the ground around them, the human team understood that their good intentions had created a nightmare beyond imagination. They had come to save a dying world and instead had triggered its complete destruction. The weight of that responsibility would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The crisis expanded beyond anyone's worst nightmares when reports began arriving from 17 different worlds across 2 star systems. Each planet with Zephyrian crystal formations was experiencing the same catastrophic growth pattern. The quantum entanglement that connected the crystal organisms had spread the corruption across distances that should have been impossible to bridge. Dr. Sullivan stared at the incoming data with growing horror. The infected worlds showed identical, patterns of crystal expansion, as if they were all following the same terrible blueprint. Mining colonies that had used small crystal formations for power generation were now being consumed by massive crystal growths that erupted from underground like geological explosions. Admiral Jack Porter arrived from Earth with a fleet of 12 ships, including the massive science vessel UES Discovery commanded by Captain Helen Scott. The Admiral had brought humanity's top scientists and engineers, but even with reinforcements, the human team felt overwhelmed by the scope of the disaster they had accidentally created. The fleet brought Dr. Nathan Wells, a theoretical physicist who specialized in quantum mechanics and subspace phenomena. He immediately began studying the crystal network's ability to communicate across interstellar distances. His preliminary findings were terrifying. The crystals were not just sharing information, they were acting as a single distributed organism, with consciousness spanning multiple star systems. Sarah Mitchell, Earth's leading quantum engineer, worked with Tony Rodriguez to analyze the fusion reactors that had triggered the catastrophe. They discovered that the human technology had not just provided energy to the crystals. It had somehow unlocked quantum properties that allowed the organisms to manipulate space and time on a fundamental level. The crystal formations were creating stable wormhole connections between distant worlds, allowing them to share energy and information instantaneously. What had once been separate crystal colonies on different planets were now parts of a single massive entity that existed across multiple dimensions. The human fusion energy had awakened something that transcended normal physics. Colonel Harris took command of evacuation efforts across all affected worlds, working with Zephyrian military leader Zexron to coordinate the largest refugee operation in galactic history. But the numbers were staggering. The affected worlds contained over 50 billion Zephyrian citizens, and the available ships could evacuate only a tiny fraction of the population. The evacuation efforts were hampered by the crystal growth itself. The expanding formations disrupted transportation networks and made many areas completely inaccessible. Refugee ships had to navigate around crystal spires that reached into space, creating navigation hazards that made landing operations extremely dangerous. Captain Blake watched from the bridge of the horizon as entire continents disappeared beneath waves of crystal growth. The formations had become so large that they were affecting planetary rotation and gravitational fields. Some worlds were beginning to break apart as crystal structures grew too large for the planet's mass to support. Veltar worked tirelessly to maintain communication between scattered Zephyrian communities, but his efforts were becoming hopeless. The crystal network was generating electromagnetic interference that disrupted all forms of communication technology. Entire populations were becoming isolated with no way to call for help or coordinate evacuations. Dr. Wells made a discovery that explained the true horror of what was happening. The crystal organisms were not just consuming the affected worlds, they were converting them into something else entirely. The planets were being transformed into nodes in a vast quantum computer that existed partially outside normal space-time. The ancient civilization that had created the crystal organisms had designed them as the ultimate terraforming tool. They were meant to convert entire galaxies into computational matrices that could support forms of consciousness that existed as pure information. The Zephyrians had been unknowingly living on top of a weapon designed to remake reality itself. Sarah Mitchell calculated that if the crystal growth continued unchecked, it would eventually consume not just the affected star systems, but would spread throughout the galaxy. The quantum connections between crystal formations allowed them to seed new growth on any world where compatible minerals existed. Given enough time, they would convert the entire Milky Way into a crystal matrix. The political situation became desperate as Zephyrian leaders from different worlds began blaming each other for the catastrophe. Some accused Veltar of being too hasty in accepting human help. Others demanded that the humans be executed for bringing destruction to their civilization. The unified Zephyrian government collapsed as communication between worlds became impossible. Admiral Porter faced an impossible decision. Earth's military protocols demanded that he protect human interests first, but billions of innocent lives were at stake. He could order the fleet to retreat to a safe distance and let the Zephyrians deal with their own catastrophe, or he could commit humanity's resources to a desperate rescue attempt that might fail completely. Dr. Wells proposed a radical solution that might stop the crystal spread but would require enormous risks. If they could generate a massive electromagnetic pulse coordinated across all affected systems simultaneously, they might be able to disrupt the quantum entanglement that allowed the crystals to communicate and reproduce. The plan would require precise timing across light years of space and would need every available human and Zephyrian ship to carry specialized pulse generators. The electromagnetic storm would destroy all electronic technology on the affected worlds, but it might break the quantum connections that were driving the crystal growth. Sarah Mitchell explained the technical challenges of the plan to Admiral Porter. They would need to position ships at calculated points throughout both star systems and fire their pulse generators within microseconds of each other. The timing had to be perfect, or the electromagnetic waves would interfere with each other and the plan would fail. The biggest problem was that someone would need to manually trigger the pulse from the epicenter of the crystal growth on the Zephyrian homeworld. The electromagnetic storm would be so intense at ground zero that no electronic equipment would survive. Whoever stayed behind to activate the system would almost certainly die in the process. Captain Blake volunteered immediately for the suicide mission. He felt responsible for the catastrophe that had resulted from humanity's first contact with alien intelligence. If someone had to die to fix the problem, it should be the person who had led the mission that caused it. Tony Rodriguez and Dr. Sullivan refused to let Blake sacrifice himself alone. They had worked together to create the fusion technology that triggered the disaster, and they insisted on staying behind to ensure the pulse generators functioned properly. All three humans accepted that they would probably not survive the electromagnetic storm. Veltar made the ultimate choice for his dying civilization. He gave permission for the human plan, knowing that it would destroy what little remained of Zephyrian technology and culture. The electromagnetic pulse would permanently disable their crystal-based civilization, but it might save the surviving population from complete extinction. The preparation for the coordinated pulse took 2 weeks of frantic work. Every available ship was converted to carry electromagnetic generators, and crews drilled constantly to achieve the split-second timing the plan required. The margin for error was so small that even tiny mistakes could doom the entire operation. Dr. Wells coordinated the timing sequence from the UES Discovery, while Captain Scott positioned the science vessel at the optimal location for generating the primary pulse wave. The other ships spread throughout both star systems, each carrying part of the massive electromagnetic array that would hopefully shatter the crystal network. As the countdown began, Captain Blake stood on the surface of the dying Zephyrian homeworld, surrounded by crystal formations that towered into the sky like alien cathedrals. The structures pulsed with internal light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some vast heartbeat. Around him, Tony Rodriguez and Dr. Sullivan made final adjustments to the ground-based pulse generators. The crystal spires had grown so large that they created their own weather systems. Lightning flickered between the formations while aurora displays painted the sky in colors that had no names. The planet no longer looked like a world where natural life could exist. It had become something alien and beautiful and terrible. Veltar remained with the human team at Ground Zero, refusing to evacuate to safety. His skin glowed with colors that indicated acceptance and resignation. He had made peace with the fact that his civilization was ending, but he wanted to witness the moment when the human plan either saved or doomed what remained of his people. The final countdown reached 0 across 18 worlds simultaneously. Electromagnetic pulse generators fired in perfect synchronization, creating a wave of energy that traveled faster than light through subspace. The effect was visible from orbit, as massive aurora displays lit up the skies of dying planets. The crystal formations shuddered and began to crack as the electromagnetic storm disrupted their quantum connections. For a moment, it seemed like the plan might work. The electromagnetic pulse struck the crystal network like a hammer blow against glass. Across 18 worlds, massive crystal formations began to shatter and dissolve as their quantum connections were severed. The effect was both beautiful and terrifying as aurora displays painted alien skies in colors that had never been seen before. Captain Blake felt the ground shake beneath his feet as the crystal spires around him began to crack and fall. The formations that had towered thousands of feet into the sky came crashing down like falling mountains, their crystalline structure dissolving into clouds of glittering dust. The sound was like the death cry of a planet. Tony Rodriguez and Dr. Sullivan huddled next to their pulse generator as electromagnetic energy tore through the atmosphere around them. The device had functioned perfectly, sending its coordinated signal across the galaxy at exactly the right moment. But now they were trapped in the eye of an electromagnetic hurricane that was tearing apart everything electronic on the planet. Veltar watched his world die with skin colors that cycled through the entire spectrum of Zephyrian emotion. The crystal formations that had defined his civilization for thousands of years were crumbling into nothing. But as the massive structures fell, he could see something else happening. The sick yellow glow that had covered the planet was fading, replaced by natural light for the first time in years. The pulse worked exactly as Dr. Wells had calculated. The quantum entanglement that connected crystal formations across star systems was completely disrupted. The massive distributed organism that had been consuming worlds died instantly as its consciousness was scattered across the galaxy. This runaway growth stopped immediately, but the cost was staggering. 14 of the 18 affected worlds were left completely uninhabitable. Their planetary cores had been cracked by the massive crystal growth, and their atmospheres had been poisoned by the electromagnetic storm. Billions of Zephyrians died as their worlds became hostile to all forms of life. Captain Blake and his team survived the electromagnetic storm, though their equipment was completely destroyed. They found themselves stranded on a world that looked like the aftermath of a geological apocalypse. The landscape was covered with crystal debris that glittered like broken glass under the alien sun. 4 worlds remained partially habitable, but they were scarred and damaged beyond recognition. The Zephyrian civilization that had built cities of living crystal was gone forever. The electromagnetic pulse had destroyed not just the runaway crystal growth, but also the foundation of their entire technology base. Admiral Porter coordinated the massive evacuation effort from orbit. The surviving human ships worked alongside, Zephyrian vessels to evacuate refugees from the dying worlds. But there were not enough ships to save everyone, and millions of Zephyrians were left behind on planets that could no longer support life. Dr. Sullivan conducted surveys of the surviving worlds and found that the crystal organisms were completely extinct. The electromagnetic pulse had disrupted their biology so thoroughly that not a single formation remained intact. The symbiotic relationship between the Zephyrians and their crystal partners was broken forever. Veltar addressed the surviving members of his species in a broadcast that reached every refugee ship and survivor settlement. His words were translated into human languages, but the meaning was clear in any tongue. The Zephyrian civilization was ending, and they had chosen to accept that fate rather than let the crystal catastrophe spread to other species. The final count of survivors was heartbreaking. Of the original 50 billion Zephyrians, fewer than 2 billion remained alive. Their ancient government had collapsed, their technology was destroyed, and their homeworld was a barren wasteland. They had become refugees in their own galaxy. Captain Blake met with Veltar in the ruins of the Zephyrian capital city to discuss what would happen next. The alien leader showed no anger toward the humans who had accidentally caused this disaster. Instead, he expressed gratitude that humanity had been willing to risk everything to stop the crystal plague from spreading to other worlds. The Zephyrian survivors made a decision that surprised everyone. They requested permission to leave the galaxy entirely, asking humanity to help them travel to the distant Andromeda galaxy where they could rebuild their civilization without risking contact with other species. They had seen what could happen when different forms of life tried to help each other. Admiral Porter agreed to provide ships and supplies for the longest journey ever attempted. Earth's most advanced vessels would escort the Zephyrian refugees across the void between galaxies, a trip that would take hundreds of years, even with the fastest human technology. It would be humanity's final gift to the people they had tried to save. Dr. Wells spent months studying the remains of the crystal network to understand what had gone wrong. His research revealed that the fusion energy had activated ancient programming that had been dormant for millions of years. The crystal organisms had been weapons all along, designed by a vanished civilization to convert galaxies into computational matrices. The preparations for the Great Exodus took 2 years. Human engineers worked with Zephyrian refugees to modify Earth's largest ships for the journey to Andromeda. The vessels were equipped with everything needed to establish a new civilization in a distant galaxy, including genetic samples and cultural records to preserve Zephyrian heritage. Sarah Mitchell developed new navigation systems that could guide the refugee fleet across the intergalactic void. The journey would be so long that multiple generations would be born and die aboard the ships before reaching their destination. The Zephyrians accepted this fate with the patience that had characterized their species for millennia. Captain Blake commanded the human escort fleet that would accompany the refugees partway to Andromeda before returning to Earth. He felt a profound sadness as he watched the last remnants of an ancient civilization preparing to leave their home galaxy forever. Their departure was a reminder of how badly humanity's first attempt at interstellar diplomacy had failed. The launch day arrived on a clear morning when both Earth's sun and the distant Zephyrian star were visible in the same sky. Thousands of ships lifted off from refugee camps and staging areas, beginning the longest journey in galactic history. The human vessels escorted them to the edge of the galaxy before turning back toward home. Dr. Sullivan wrote the final report on the Zephyrian contact mission. The document was classified at the highest levels and locked away in secure facilities on Earth. The official story told to the public was that the Zephyrian civilization had declined to pursue further contact with humanity, choosing to remain isolated in their distant star system. Only a few dozen people knew the truth about what had really happened. Humanity's first contact with alien intelligence had resulted in the near extinction of an entire species. The disaster served as a stark reminder that good intentions and advanced technology were not enough to prevent catastrophic mistakes. President Johnson established the Extraterrestrial Contact Protocol based on the lessons learned from the Zephyrian tragedy. The new guidelines required extensive study and simulation before any human technology could be shared with alien civilizations. Future contact missions would proceed with extreme caution to prevent similar disasters. Captain Blake retired from active service, but continued to work as an advisor on interstellar relations. He spent his remaining years developing safety protocols and training procedures designed to prevent other species from suffering the same fate as the Zephyrians. His experience became the foundation for humanity's approach to galactic citizenship. Tony Rodriguez and Dr. Sullivan collaborated on research projects aimed at understanding the fundamental differences between human and alien biology. Their work helped establish the principle that what was helpful for one species could be deadly for another. The fusion technology that had seemed like a perfect solution had instead triggered an ancient doomsday weapon. Veltar sent a final message to Earth before the refugee fleet disappeared beyond the edge of the galaxy. His words were simple but carried the weight of an entire civilization's farewell. He thanked humanity for their good intentions and wished them wisdom in their future encounters with other species. He hoped that other civilizations would learn from the mistakes that had cost his people their galaxy. Years passed, and occasional signals from the refugee fleet confirmed that the Zephyrians were surviving their long journey to Andromeda. The report spoke of children being born in space, of new technologies being developed for life between galaxies, and of hope for rebuilding their civilization in a distant realm where crystal organisms had never existed. Earth continued to explore the galaxy and make contact with other alien species, but always with the memory of the Zephyrian tragedy as a guide. Each new encounter was approached with careful study and extensive safety protocols. Humanity had learned that their greatest strength, the ability to act quickly and decisively in crisis situations, could also be their most dangerous weakness. The universe remained vast and full of wonders, but humans now understood that it was also fragile beyond imagination. The difference between salvation and catastrophe could be as small as a single